the New York Times, in which in the first page on foreign news is a news about the Ukraine. And you learn that the Ukraine is the only country which is now going to have a Jewish president and a Jewish prime minister. And you learn that only 5% of the Ukrainians would oppose the idea of having a Jewish president, as opposed to 23% of the Lithuanians, 22% of the Romanians. I am taking this from today's newspaper, so that's how I am footnoting what I am saying. Now, all this is relevant because what I'm going to talk about, what I must talk about, is that the Ukraine had the reputation of being the most anti-Semitic place anywhere at its time. So the point is that everything is changing, and what anti-Semitism means varies from time to time. Indeed, I want to talk about two subjects. One is about anti-Semitism, and I want to talk about the variety of anti-Semitism. What is anti-Semitism? And the second, I want to talk about the Civil War. I want to talk about a situation in which authority breaks down. It seems to me that, quote unquote, the success of the pogroms, you needed these two things. One is the pre-existence of anti-Semitism, of course, and the second, to live in a moment of anarchy. Because, I mean, after all, as we know, pogroms have taken place in the Ukraine before, in the course of which some dozens of people were killed here and there. But now we are talking about, well, 100, 200,000 victims, which is the largest number of victims of an anti-Jewish terror in between the middle of the 17th century, the pogroms of Khmelnytsky, you may know, and the Holocaust. Now, it seems to me that all this could happen only at the time of the Civil War and the big breakdown of authority. But there is no authority. Now, you could argue, rightly so, that actually there's another way that mass murder can take place, and that is, of course, the Nazi experience, where indeed there was highly organized authority, when there was a totalitarian state which put the killing of Jews at the center of its ideological purpose and ideological task. But all right, so there are two possibilities for mass murder. One is anarchy, and the other is a highly organized state which is willing to carry out this task. So let me talk first about what it seems to be the varieties of anti-Semitism. We think that when you hear the word anti-Semitic, you got what it is. Well, indeed, the varieties of anti-Semitism have obviously, by definition, much in common. But it's very important for us to understand where those various anti-Semites come from, so to speak. And this is one of the reasons that it's worth talking about the pogroms of 1919, because what we see here is that these different forms, people who have different purposes, different goals, come together, and we can see that at the various stages of what was going on in the course of 1919. Well, I think it is self-evident that the anti-Semitism of a British lord who looks at the Jews as a kind of, well, contemptible parvenu, it's a different form of anti-Semitism than that of a Ukrainian peasant who feels that the Jews were exploiting them. And it's, of course, it's a different form of anti-Semitism, as I will be talking about in some detail, of the Russian army officer who regarded the Jews as responsible for the ills of the country and the destruction of Russia, in which they felt themselves at home and, I suppose, in their own way, loved. Now, it seems to me that, first of all, we must start, when we talk about anti-Semitism, of not what the Jews were doing, but who the Jews were. Now, who the Jews were, and I'm talking about early 20th century Europe, which is relevant for our discussion, who the Jews were. But first of all, there's an obvious distinction between Eastern Europe and Western Europe. Now, Eastern Europe and Western Europe, in Western Europe, thank you, that's a help, because periodically I will just say here. When we talk about the Western European Jewry, that the Jewry has been emancipated. Emancipation meaning nothing more than doing away with laws which applied only to Jews, which in the case of the Russian Empire occurred only with the Russian Revolution of 1917. And this next step is acculturation. And the Western European Jews were acculturated. By this I mean is that they looked like everybody else. And when you walked in the street, you couldn't tell who a Jew was. This, by the way, did not eliminate anti-Semitism, because in a sense, it made the Jews more dangerous, because you didn't know that they are behind everything, and therefore you couldn't tell. And then there is the third stage, is assimilation. And my point is that assimilation has never been taking place except in modern United States. The Western European Jews were not assimilated. And of course, the Eastern European Jews were not even acculturated. So, the Jews were very successful. First in Western Europe, and then to a lesser extent, of course, opportunities were not nearly as wide open as they were in the West, but also in Eastern Europe, including the Russian Empire. And by this I mean is that some Jews actually had a role to play in the economic life of the nation, establishing factories, textile, banking, or what have you. And then, more importantly, became socialists. Why did they become socialists? Nothing is easier to explain. First of all, they did not feel themselves Ukrainians. Why didn't they feel themselves Ukrainian? Needs no explanation. The Ukrainians didn't think that they were Ukrainians either, so that was fine. There's no problem here. Also, and that's perhaps more open to discussion, is that there is something in the Jewish religion which, well, I say this with some embarrassment, which predisposes you toward the idea that you take the side of the downtrodden and the poor. I may be deluding myself, so I don't know. But that's, it seems to me. Then the third thing would be, is that you rebel. You rebel against your father's religion because it's much too restricting, and so you join the socialists. Well, now why did the Jews become successful? It seems to me that they became successful because they brought themselves something from the pre-emancipation stage, which suddenly in the New World, which by the way did not create modernity, they did not create industrialization. They were there to be able to take advantage. Why were they able to take advantage? What did they bring with themselves? I think, first of all, literacy. A Jewish man had to be able to read the Torah, the Talmud, and that suddenly became a very useful tool in the modern world. Second, they were excluded from agriculture. Isn't that wonderful? What did it mean in concrete terms? They were the first to move into cities, and the action was in cities rather than in the countryside. They could do this because there was no land to leave behind, which is a problem. Third, because they were persecuted, and therefore they depended on one another. Now, the Jews were not the only minority who were in a similar position, but I think this notion that you are responsible for your fellow Jew was helpful when you wanted to establish a business. Now, sometimes it turned out that actually your fellow Jew was a scoundrel and running away with money. But by and large, you were more likely to be able to trust. And then fourth is the experience in financial administration. Now, how did that come about? It came about because Jews, as all Mosaic religions, opposed the idea of lending money on interest. Yes, but you could lend money to a non-Jew, and that was okay. By the way, I mean, this would be perfectly true of other major religions. And so that also, in the New World, it turned out to be an advantage. Now, my point is that for us to understand modern anti-Semitism, we have to presuppose that the Jews achieved a certain degree of success. Because at least for some of the anti-Semites, those who were actually most responsible for the bitterness of the pogroms, actually feared the Jews. The Jews were behind it all. The idea of Jewish Bolshevism. The Jews are controlling. Now, it is difficult for you to see how anybody could take this for granted because it was so obviously contrary to fact and contrary to everything which we know. That is, the Jews were disproportionately represented in the socialist and Bolshevik leadership. But most Jews were not socialists, most Jews were not Bolsheviks, and most Bolsheviks were not Jews. But nonetheless, there is enough truth in this as to make it believable, as to put this at the center of your ideology. And I was taken aback time and again reading the writings of the white officers, that how seriously they took this, how they believed that Jews stand for modernity, and they disliked that modernity. Now, the Jews did not bring about modernity. But by the way, I think this is with us to our days, namely the identification of Jews and modernity. That is, people who are uncomfortable in the world in which we live are more likely not to like Jews than to like Jews, as opposed to those of us who believe that the world is getting better and better all the time, have less problem with Jews. Now, this connection between Jews and Bolshevism and Jews and communism was, of course, to be a central feature of Nazi ideology. And what I want to convey is that how seriously they took this. I mean, this was not something which they pretended. They did not use this as a propaganda weapon. The very heart of their being, they believed that it is really the Jews who destroyed the world in which they live, and the Jews are responsible. All right. Should I stop here for a moment for you to express your disagreement or
I have a question.
Yes, please.
You mentioned that there are two ways that anti-Semitism spread in the New World, one being anarchy, and the other being from authority.
Totalitarian, no?
Okay, totalitarian.
Yes.
Where does the Bessarabia 1903 pogroms, how does that fit into that?
Well, what I am saying is that yes, Jews were killed here and there, but we are talking about mass murder. There we were talking about a few dozens, and here we are talking about hundreds of thousands.
600 women raped, that's a small number?
Can we have the questions after?
No, it was I.
Oh,
who said that
no,
easy.
I know.
No,
Okay.
it was
Okay.
I. No. Well, as some of you know, as far as I know, there are only 3 words in the Russian language which comes into English. One is vodka, the other is tsar, and the third is pogrom. That is, we are talking about a long tradition of pogroms, and indeed the great mass murder took place in the middle of the 17th century, which was a time of anarchy and crisis, great social upheaval. And indeed, these pogroms, such as Kishinev, 1903, took place at a time of social upheaval. But these pogroms occurred in cities where, well, I mean, I don't want to be depicted that I say, well, a few hundred or a few dozen doesn't matter. It does matter, but we are talking about a different situation when we talk about mass murder, where there are waves and waves of violence, where different aspects of anti-Semitism, church-inspired, nationally inspired, and so on and so forth. Now, let me turn to my next topic, namely the Civil War, the anarchy. Well, what was the Russian Revolution? It seems to me that the Russian Revolution was a breakdown of one form of government. That is, the Tsarist regime was not defeated and destroyed by a well-organized opposition which had a different set of principles, and they brought down the regime and then came into power and lived there happily after. That's not the way it was. I think it became evident at the course of the First World War that the Tsarist ideology, the Tsarist method of governing at the time of the modern war in the 20th century simply cannot cope. And I like to mention this, the famous exchange between Nicholas and the British Prime Minister, the British ambassador. A British ambassador said to the Tsar, I think it was January 17, Sire, you must do something to regain the confidence of your people. Because the British were aware that things are not going well. And the Tsar pulled himself up. It is the people who have to regain my confidence. Well, I mean, this is all very sweet, but that's not the way that you can govern a 20th century state in the modern war. So the Tsarism could not survive. But what will take its place? The liberals. That makes you laugh. That's just not the way it works. I mean, all was very sweet in between the February and the October Revolution. It's very nice. But the liberals did not have the means. They did not operate on the basis of an ideology on which authority could be reconstructed. And then we come to the complete disintegration. And that is what November 1917 was. It's not that the Bolsheviks really overcame the armies of the liberals and then came to power. What happened in the Winter Palace in November 1917, that the ministers were meeting, and then some few Bolsheviks appeared and said that you are under arrest, and that was that. However, there's a long way to go from here. The really important part of the Russian Revolution is what happened afterwards. Namely, how, under the basis of what principle, can you establish authority? And that, again, is not the way it goes, that the more people are on your side, the easier it is going to be. We know perfectly well that on election results in January 1918, the Bolsheviks did not possess the majority. The majority would have gone to various forms of socialism, above all the socialist revolutionaries, a perfectly nice bunch of people. Again, that's not good enough. It's not good enough to win elections. You have to organize an army. You have to organize an administration which will enforce your will. And it seemed to me that ultimately there were two groups who possessed an ideology on the basis it was possible to reorganize, to establish authority. One of them was, of course, the Bolsheviks by definition. The other were counter-revolutionary, the whites. Each had an ideology on the basis of which you could put together an army. And that's what it's all about. The evidence is very clear that the majority of the Russian people, like the anarchists, peasant bands, who stood for what they perceived volia, freedom. Again, you cannot imagine a Nestor Makhno or a Grigoriev to organize a functioning administration. The whites could have, and the Bolsheviks, obviously, we know they could have because they did. Now we come to the pogroms. And what is interesting here is that there are so many sides. First of all, foreigners. In 1917, 1918, a part of the Ukraine is under German and Austro-Hungarian occupation. Well, the Germans are organized, the Germans are disciplined. Under German occupation of Ukraine, there were no pogroms. However, the Germans believed that the Jews are on the other side. Everybody believes that the Jews are always on the other side. The Austrian generals were forbidding their soldiers to fraternize with the Jews because the Jews are going to mislead you. So, on the one hand. On the other hand, I should have mentioned before that in the course of the First World War, the Tsarist regime wanted to remove Jews from the front line because they assumed that the Jews were treacherous. The Jews you cannot trust them. And indeed, that was the beginning of Jewish suffering. By the way, as you perhaps know, the Jews in the Russian Empire lived in 25 provinces. We are talking about the modern day Ukraine, Belarus, the three Baltic republics, and Bessarabia. That is not in Russia. That is Russians, that is the Russian part of the Russian Empire had very few Jews. The great influx into Russia came with the Russian Revolution. There were individuals who were particularly successful, who received permission, who could set up businesses in the Russian part. But by and large, the Russian peasant never saw a Jew, which of course did not prevent them from being anti-Semitic. The Russian church made a major contribution to anti-Semitic pogroms. That is the record.